My boss ordered me to bathe his comatose father myself. No nurses. Washing his hand, I recognized my late father's wedding ring on his finger. I froze. That's the short version. Here's what actually happened. My name's Joe Calder. I'm 34. And 11 months ago, I was working as a private in-home aide for a family called the Ashworths, out in Lake Forest, north of Chicago. Not the kind of Lake Forest with a Target and a strip mall. The kind with a private security gate and a road that isn't on Google Maps because the Homeowners Association paid to have it blurred. I'd been placed there through an agency called Halcyon Home Care, 3 months into a 6-month contract, care managing the household for Julian Ashworth, 41, CEO of Ashworth Capital, and personally assisting with his father, Foster Ashworth, 76, who'd been in a persistent vegetative state for 14 months after a massive stroke. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because it matters for everything after. I didn't take that job because I needed the money, though I did. I took it because 6 weeks before Halcyon placed me, I'd Googled Foster Ashworth's name for the first time in 11 years, out of nowhere, at 1 a.m., the way you do when you can't sleep and your brain starts digging through old dirt on its own, and a listing had come up for a private caregiver position at the Ashworth estate. I applied under my married name, Calder being my maiden name that I'd gone back to after the divorce, but I put J. Ashfield, my ex's surname, on the application, just in case anyone at that house still remembered a Calder. Because 11 years ago, my father, Miles Calder, drowned at a company retreat house on Pine Lake, Wisconsin, at a corporate function thrown by Ashworth Capital. He was 52. He was a senior forensic accountant, not the kind of employee who gets invited to lake house weekends, except that year he had been, specifically, for the first time in his 14 years there. He went out for a walk after dinner on a Friday night in September and didn't come back. They found his body 6 days later, 4 miles downstream, snagged on a fallen tree. Cause of death, drowning, ruled accidental. No alcohol in his system, no signs of a heart attack or stroke. His phone was never recovered. His reading glasses, which he wore every waking hour of his life, which he slept in half the time because he'd doze off reading, were found folded neatly in his jacket pocket back at the lake house, not on his body, not anywhere near the water. My mother got a wrongful death settlement 8 months later, $175,000, structured as a lump sum, paid by Ashworth Capital's insurer, with a confidentiality clause that meant she couldn't discuss the terms with anyone, including me, until I was 25, and she finally told me the number over a glass of wine she wasn't supposed to be drinking with her medication. She died 5 years ago, of heart failure. Her cardiologist told me, off the record, was accelerated by chronic stress. She never once said she thought someone had hurt him. She also never once said she thought it was an accident. So when I saw that caregiver listing, I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself a lot of things. I got the job on a Tuesday in April. My first 3 months were unremarkable. I did meal prep, medication schedules, physical therapy transfers, laundry, the parts of caregiving nobody puts in a brochure. Foster had a full clinical nursing team, 3 RNs rotating 12-hour shifts, a respiratory therapist twice a week, a physician who visited every Thursday at 4 p.m. exactly. I wasn't clinical staff. I was household support. I fed him through his G-tube when the nurse asked me to assist. I helped reposition him every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores, and twice a week I helped whichever nurse was on shift with his bathing, mostly holding towels and running water, because
Sorry to interrupt. Real quick before the story continues. If this story hit close to home, here's the thing. Most people don't figure this stuff out until years later, after it's already cost them something. I put together the manipulation playbook so you don't have to learn it the hard way. 49 patterns, real examples, and exactly what to do the moment you spot one. It's already helped hundreds of people see clearly what took me years to figure out. Links in the description. Okay, back to what happened.
Foster was 210 pounds of dead weight, and it took 2 people minimum. Julian Ashworth I saw maybe once a week, usually gliding through the East Wing in a suit at 6:45 a.m., on his way to a car that took him to the Loop, occasionally stopping to ask me something clipped and specific. Had his father's oxygen saturation stayed above 94 overnight? Had the new mattress topper arrived? Was I the one who'd left a coffee ring on the file cabinet in the study? He wasn't cruel exactly. He was the kind of controlled that reads as cold. I watched that control turn on someone directly for the first time on a Wednesday morning in June, the 18th, a little after 8 a.m. The night nurse, a woman named Denise Whitlow, who'd been with the family for 6 years, had posted in a private healthcare industry forum the week before, asking for advice on preventing pressure sores in a high-profile, high-net-worth client with limited mobility. No names, no photos of Foster, just a single wide shot of an empty hospital-grade bed and a mattress topper, the kind of clinical question nurses ask each other all the time. Somehow it had made its way to a gossip account that covered Chicago's wealthy families, with a caption speculating about which local tycoon was hiding a health crisis. Julian called Denise into the front hall while I was refilling the coffee station 6 feet away, close enough to hear every word. "You understand what you've done," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Ashworth, there's nothing identifying in that post. I never said his name. I never said your name." "You put a photograph of my father's room into a public forum," Julian said, his voice never rising, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You have 4 minutes to collect your things from the staff closet. Security will walk you to the gate." 6 years, Denise said, and I could hear her voice cracking. "I've been with your father for 6 years, Julian. I held his hand the night of the stroke. stroke, 4 minutes, he said, and turned and walked back toward the stairs without another word. And I stood there with the coffee pot still in my hand, watching Denise gather herself, humiliated, in a front hall the size of my entire apartment. She caught my eye on her way out the door, suitcase wheels catching on the marble threshold, and said only, "Watch yourself in here," before the door closed behind her. I remember thinking, very clearly, I need to be careful in this house. I had no idea yet how careful I actually needed to be. That's the context for the Tuesday in August that changed everything. It was August 12th, a little after 7 p.m. The regular night nurse, a woman named Priya Anand, had called in sick with what turned out to be a stomach flu, and her backup from the agency had a car breakdown 40 minutes out. Julian came to find me in the kitchen while I was portioning Foster's overnight tube feed. "Foster needs his bath," he said. "Priya's out. The relief nurse is delayed. I can wait for her," I said. "It's only a bath. It's not urgent tonight. I don't want a stranger from an agency roster touching my father," Julian said. "You've done it before, with Priya. You know the protocol. Do it yourself tonight." I want to be honest that I didn't think anything of it beyond mild irritation. I wasn't a nurse. I wasn't supposed to be doing full personal care solo, and if anything had gone medically sideways, I'd have been the one liable, not him. But he said it in the tone he said everything, flat and final. And I'd learned in 3 months that arguing with Julian Ashworth cost you more than it saved you. So I went up, my socks silent on the runner in the hallway, the house doing that thing old money houses do at night, where every sound gets swallowed by too much square footage and too much money spent on soundproofing. Foster's room took up most of the East Wing's second floor, a hospital bed disguised under a custom bed frame, a hydraulic lift bolted discreetly into the ceiling joists, monitors tucked into a converted armoire so the room wouldn't look like an ICU. I ran the basin water to 98 degrees, laid out the washcloths, and got to work the way Priya had trained me. Face and neck first, then arms, moving the limbs gently through their limited range to prevent contracture, checking his skin every few inches for any new breakdown. Foster's right hand had a mild contracture already, the fingers slightly curled from 14 months of disuse. And as I worked the washcloth around his knuckles, I felt something catch, a ring, on his right ring finger, which struck me as odd before it struck me as anything else, because Foster wore his wedding band, thin and platinum, on his left hand. I'd washed that hand a dozen times. This was a second ring on the right hand, heavier, gold, with a flat rectangular face instead of a rounded band. I lifted his hand to clean under it and turned it slightly toward the lamp, and that's when I saw the engraving worn into the inside of the band, the kind you only see if you know to look, if you've spent 11 years running your thumb over an identical inscription on a ring your mother kept in a felt box in her nightstand until the day she died. MC plus LC, 6/14/97, Miles Calder. Lila Calder, June 14th, 1997, my parents' wedding date. I did not gasp. I did not drop his hand. I remember that very specifically because in the moment my body did something strange and clinical. It kept washing. My hands kept moving the cloth over his knuckles, while the rest of me went somewhere very far away and very cold. I set his hand back down on the towel, finished the bath in 11 more minutes exactly, because I counted, because counting was the only thing keeping me upright, repositioned him, logged the bath time in the care binder the way I was supposed to. 7:41 p.m. to 8:12 p.m. Skin intact, no new areas of concern, and walked out of that room and down 2 flights of stairs and out the side door into the garden before I let myself throw up into the boxwood hedge. Because that ring wasn't lost. I knew that for a fact, the same way you know your own name. When the search team recovered my father's body 4 miles downstream after 6 days in Pine Lake, his wedding ring wasn't on his hand. The report noted it. Hand and fingers showed no signs of jewelry indentation consistent with long-term wear, suggesting the ring had been removed prior to the incident or lost in the water. My mother had assumed it slipped off in the lake, his fingers thinned from 6 days submerged, and she'd grieved that detail almost as much as she'd grieved him, that even his ring hadn't stayed with him at the end. That ring had a resizing mark inside the band, a tiny stamped R2 from the jeweler, Kessler and Vance on Wabash, because my father's fingers had thinned from a gallbladder surgery 2 years into the marriage, and my mother had had it resized twice, once smaller, once back out again when he regained the weight. I didn't need to see the R2 stamp to know it was there. I knew that ring the way you know your childhood bedroom in the dark. It was on Foster Ashworth's hand. 14 months into a coma, in a locked wing of a house I had no business working in, on the hand of a man whose company had employed my father the year he died. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed in the staff cottage behind the main house, a converted carriage apartment Halcyon rented for live-in placements, with my laptop open to a blank document, typing and deleting the same sentence for 2 hours. I think Foster Ashworth has my father's ring. It looked insane on the screen. It looked insane in my head too, honestly, except that I'd washed that man's hand and felt the exact contour of a resizing scar on the inside of a gold band I could have drawn from memory. I couldn't ask anyone, not Julian, obviously. If there was anything to this, the last person on earth I wanted knowing I'd noticed was the man currently controlling my access to that house. Not the nursing staff, who'd report anything unusual straight to Julian's assistant within the hour. That was the culture there. So I did the only thing that made sense to a person whose father had spent 14 years as a forensic accountant before he became a case file himself. I started documenting quietly, and I decided not to say a word until I had something nobody could argue with. 3 days later, on the 15th, Priya was back on shift, and I volunteered to help with Foster's bath again, which wasn't unusual. We'd done it together together a dozen times. While she checked his catheter line, I took my phone out under the pretense of checking the time and got 2 photos of the ring, one wide, one close on the engraving, in about 4 seconds, angled so it looked like I was just glancing at my screen. My hands were shaking badly enough that the first shot came out blurred. The second one was clear enough to read the date. That night, I pulled the old file box out of my storage unit in Skokie, 40 minutes each way on my one afternoon off, a box I hadn't opened since my mother's funeral. Inside was the original police report from Walworth County, Wisconsin, the insurance adjuster's file, and a manila envelope of photographs my mother had kept from the search, including, I remembered now with my stomach dropping, a close-up photo the investigator had taken of my father's bare left hand at the recovery site, taken specifically to document the absence of the ring, dated September 22nd, 1997. No, that's wrong. I mean 2013, the year he died. I keep saying the wedding date because it's carved into my head. September 22nd, 2013, 6 days after he went missing. I laid that 16-year-old photo next to the picture I'd taken 3 nights before on my phone, and the mismatch hit me like a physical blow. Whatever had happened to that ring between the water and Foster Ashworth's hand, it hadn't happened by accident, and it definitely hadn't happened in a lake. The next week gave me my second piece. I'd started, very casually, asking questions of the one person in that house who'd been there longer than anyone, Ruben Ferreira, 61, the Ashworth's longtime driver and groundskeeper, who'd worked for the family for 22 years, and who liked to talk to me while I hung laundry near the equipment shed because, in his words, everyone else in that house treated him like part of the furniture. I asked him offhand if he remembered a company retreat up in Wisconsin, years back, some kind of accident. Ruben went quiet in a way that told me more than words would have. Then he said, "The accountant. Yeah, I remember that week." He kept coiling a hose while he talked, not looking at me. Mr. Foster went up there himself, middle of the week, which he never did. He hated that lake house, said it smelled like mildew. Took the Suburban up on a Thursday, came back Friday night, real late, and told me to have it detailed first thing Saturday morning before anybody else touched it. Whole interior. I remember because it was already spotless. Nothing needed detailing. Detailed how? I asked, keeping my voice as flat as I could manage. Steam clean, full valet, inside, and trunk. Ruben shrugged like it was nothing, like he hadn't just handed me a nail for a coffin I was still building. Rich people are particular. Didn't think twice about it at the time. I did the math walking back to the cottage that night with my hands jammed in my pockets so Ruben wouldn't see them shaking. My father disappeared on a Friday night. His body was found 6 days later on a Wednesday. If Foster Ashworth drove himself up to that lake house on a Thursday and came back late Friday, the same night my father vanished, and had his car scrubbed the next morning, that put Foster Ashworth at Pine Lake at almost exactly the hour my father walked out for what my mother's whole life had been told was an evening stroll. I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night for the rest of that week. I remember standing in the cottage kitchen at 2 a.m., with a mug of tea gone cold in my hands, staring at nothing, running the same loop. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe there's an explanation, maybe I'm building a house out of 2 bricks, and then picking my phone back up and looking at that ring photo again until the loop started over. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, I called Dot Ferraro, 71, my mother's closest friend from their book club, a woman who'd sat with my mother through most of the bad years after my father died, and who I hadn't spoken to since the funeral. I told her I'd been thinking about my dad a lot lately, and asked, as gently as I could, if she remembered anything odd from that last year of his life. "Odd how, honey?" Dot asked, and I could hear a television playing low in the background, the particular hush of someone settling into an evening. Work stuff. Did he ever mention anything about trouble at Ashworth? There was a pause I felt more than heard. "He came to your mother's birthday dinner that August," Dot finally said, "and he pulled me aside in the kitchen while your mom was cutting the cake, and he told me he'd found something in the numbers that scared him. Wouldn't say exactly what. Said he was going to have to report it to somebody outside the company, the SEC maybe, and that it might cost him his job, but he couldn't sit on it. I told him to be careful. He laughed it off, said Miles Calder wasn't the type men like that worried about." She went quiet again. "I've thought about that conversation 100 times over the years, Joe. I never told your mother. I didn't want to give her one more reason to wonder." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after we hung up, staring at the water stain on the cottage ceiling that looked, if you squinted, a little like the outline of Wisconsin. My father hadn't just stumbled into a billing discrepancy. He'd found something big enough to be afraid of, and he decided to report it anyway. The third piece I found by accident, which is the part of this that still unsettles me most, because it meant it had been sitting there the whole time, 3 months, waiting for someone to look. Part of my household duties included managing Foster's correspondence archive. Julian had inherited boxes of his father's old business files when Foster's downtown office was cleared out after the stroke, and they'd been dumped, uncatalogued, into a converted mudroom off the kitchen that the family called the Annex. My job was ostensibly to organize them for a family archivist Julian kept saying he'd hire and never did. On September 3rd, 3 weeks after the bath, I was sorting a box labeled 2013 correspondence, Miskey and Foster's handwriting, mostly golf club renewals and charity gala invitations, when I found a single sheet folded into quarters and shoved behind a false bottom of loose cardboard at the base of the box. The kind of thing you'd only find if you were emptying the box completely, which I was, because I was looking for exactly this. It was a handwritten memo on Ashworth capital letterhead, undated, in Foster's own slanted handwriting, addressed to no one. The kind of note a man writes to himself and never intends anyone else to read. 4 lines. Calder situation resolved. HL well handled. Full payment wired, account closed. This does not leave this room. I read it maybe 30 times standing in that annex with dust in my nose and my heart going so hard I could feel it in my throat. Calder situation. My father's name is Calder. There is no other Calder in any file I ever found in that house. I photographed the memo from 4 angles, put it back exactly where I'd found it, behind the false cardboard bottom, in the same box, in the same position, because I understood by then that if anyone realized I'd seen it, everything would end before it started. HL took me another 9 days to identify. I found the initials again, this time on a wire authorization form buried in the same box. Ashworth Capital, September 20th, 2013, $40,000. Payee listed only as H. Lutz Consulting, 2 days before my father's body was found. A man named Harmon Lutz. I found him through a skip trace site for $29.99 on a burner email I'd made specifically for this. A 68-year-old former private investigator, license revoked in Illinois in 2015 for reasons the state database wouldn't specify without a records request, currently living in Merrillville, Indiana. I sat with his name and address open on my screen for 3 full days before I worked up the nerve to call. In between, life at the Ashworth house kept happening around me like nothing was wrong, which was its own kind of unbearable. On September 11th, Julian called me into his study at 9 p.m. to ask why Foster's physical therapy log showed a missed Tuesday session. I'd covered for the therapist's late arrival by noting it as rescheduled instead of missed, a small kindness that suddenly felt loaded with meaning, because I was standing in that man's study lying to protect the family's paperwork, while a memo with my father's name on it sat 40 feet away in a cardboard box. Julian studied me for a second longer than the moment called for and said, "You seem tired lately." I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping in the heat. He said, "Try the sound machine in the guest room, it's better than the one you have," and went back to his laptop. And I stood there for a second, not sure if I'd just been read or if I was losing my mind from paranoia. I almost broke twice that week. The first time was September 14th, a Sunday, when I found myself alone with Julian in the kitchen while he made coffee before his golf game, and the question was right there in my throat. Does your father wear a second ring on his right hand? Do you know where it came from? Close enough that I actually opened my mouth. What came out instead was, has your dad always worn that ring, the gold one, or is that new? As casually as I could manage, reaching for a mug like it didn't matter. Julian didn't even look up from his phone. No idea. My mother's people were sentimental about jewelry. Could be hers, could be his father's. I've never asked. Then he left for his tea time, and I stood there in the kitchen with my hands flat on the counter, breathing, understanding that either he genuinely didn't know what that ring was, which meant Foster had never told him, or he was better at lying than I'd given him credit for. I decided that morning that I wasn't ready to find out which. Not yet. Not until I had more than a feeling and a photograph. I called Harmon Lutz on September 17th, a Wednesday, at 6:40 p.m., using a call masking app so my number wouldn't come up. I told him I was a journalist doing a retrospective piece on unsolved corporate deaths in Illinois in the 2010s, working freelance, and I was hoping to ask him a few background questions about consulting work he'd done years ago. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Who gave you my name?" A source who asked not to be named. "I'm just trying to confirm some dates. Did you do consulting work for Ashworth Capital in 2013? Another long pause, breathing on the line, and then, "I'm not talking about Ashworth. Lose this number." But he didn't hang up right away. There were maybe 4 more seconds of silence, and in that silence, I heard him exhale, long and shaky, the sound of a man who's been carrying something for 11 years and just felt someone's hand brush against the edge of it. Then he said, quieter, almost to himself more than to me, "I didn't think anybody was supposed to die. I was told it was a scare, that's all. A scare." And he hung up. I sat on my bed with the phone still in my hand for probably 20 minutes. I didn't think anybody was supposed to die. Not a confession, not exactly. Nothing I could take to a courtroom on its own. But it was the first time in 11 years that anyone connected to my father's death had said out loud that it hadn't been an accident. I called an attorney the following Monday, September 22nd. I remember the date because it was, without my planning it, 11 years to the day since my father's body was pulled out of Pine Lake. Her name was Renata Osei, a civil litigator in the Loop who specialized in reopening wrongful death cases with new evidence, and I'd found her through a paralegal I used to work with at my old job before I went into caregiving. I laid it all out for her over 90 minutes in her office on the 14th floor of a building on LaSalle. The ring, the photographs, the memo, the wire transfer, Lutz's 4 words on the phone. Renata was quiet for a while after I finished, turning a pen over in her hands. "This is a strong circumstantial chain," she finally said. "It's not enough on its own to reopen a criminal case. The memo alone, a good defense attorney tears it apart as ambiguous, could be about anything with a name Calder. The wire transfer, same issue. Consulting fees aren't illegal. What you actually have that's airtight is the ring itself, physically, on Foster Ashworth's body right now, today, which is either the most damning piece of evidence in this whole thing or the one piece someone can make disappear the second they realize you've seen it." She leaned forward. "You need one more thing before you do anything with this. You need someone with authority in that house, someone who isn't you, someone with standing, to see that ring and understand what it means, in front of witnesses who can't be paid off or fired the next morning. A private confrontation, they bury it. You need it public." She was right, and I knew exactly when the opportunity was coming, because Julian had been talking about it for weeks. Ashworth Capital's 40th anniversary gala was scheduled for October 9th at the Peninsula Hotel downtown. 400 guests, board members, major clients, 3 local news crews for the society pages, and as the centerpiece of the evening, a tribute to Foster, the firm's founder, wheeled out in person for a photo moment before the ballroom, a portrait unveiling, and the launch of something called the Foster Ashworth Integrity in Business Award, an irony so heavy I actually laughed out loud. The first time I read the invitation card sitting on the front hall table, I was assigned to accompany Foster that night, which had already been decided before any of this started. I was, after all, his caregiver, and someone medically trained needed to be within arm's reach of him in a public setting for the 20 minutes he'd be out of the house. Nobody in that family had any idea they were about to hand me a room full of witnesses. The 17 days between Renata's office and the gala were the longest of my adult life. I photographed every remaining document I could find in the annex without disturbing their positions. I got Priya, who by then had noticed something was wrong with me, and when I finally told her a version of it over coffee on October 1st, didn't hesitate. She agreed to be in the room that night off the clock as a witness, because she said, and I'm quoting her exactly, "I've watched that family throw away good people my whole career there. I'm not standing by for this one." I asked Ruben, too, carefully, without telling him everything, just enough. Would he be willing to say, in a room full of people, what he'd told me about that week in 2013? He looked at me for a long moment in the equipment shed and said, "I've wondered about that week for 11 years. Yeah, I'll say it." On October 5th, 4 days before the gala, I took the train downtown on my afternoon off and walked into Kessler and Vance on Wabash for the first time in my life, a narrow storefront squeezed between a dry cleaner and a shuttered travel agency. Bells over the door announcing me to an empty shop. The man behind the counter was maybe 30, and when I explained what I was looking for, an old custom order, a resizing record from the late 90s, a ring engraved MC and LC. He told me the current owner had only taken over from his grandfather 4 years ago, and the older paper files were still boxed in the back, uncatalogued. I gave him the approximate date, June of 1997, and the R2 resize stamp, and he disappeared into the back room for almost 40 minutes, while I stood at the counter with my heart going too fast, staring at a case of engagement rings I couldn't afford, trying not to look as desperate as I felt. He came back with a yellowed index card and a plastic sleeve, the store's original order form, handwritten, Calder, M, 14K gold band, custom wrecked, base, engrave interior per client spec, 612.97, pickup 613.97, and beneath it, a second line added later in different ink, resize 1, 899, resize plus 1, 403. 2 resizes, exactly matching what my mother had told me my whole life, on a card that had sat in a cardboard box for 27 years, waiting for someone to ask. I photographed that card from every angle the shop's lighting allowed, and the young jeweler, once I explained enough of why I needed it, not everything, just that it mattered for a legal matter involving my late father, made me a certified color copy on the store's letterhead, free of charge, and told me quietly that he hoped it helped. I walked out onto Wabash with that copy folded in my coat pocket, and for the first time in 8 weeks, I felt something other than dread. I felt like I was finally holding a piece of paper nobody could talk their way around. The night before the gala, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the cottage with every piece of evidence spread across my bed, the 2 photographs of the police report and my own ring photo side by side, the memo, the wire authorization, a printed transcript I'd typed from memory of Lutz's 4 words on the phone, and I thought about my mother, 5 years gone, who never got to see any of this, who died still believing her husband had simply, senselessly drowned. The Peninsula Ballroom on October 9th held, by the event coordinator's own count, 412 guests, chandeliers, a string quartet, a step-and-repeat banner for photos near the entrance, and at 7:50 p.m., right on schedule, 2 of Foster's aides wheeled him out in a custom chair to a spot near the stage, positioned so the light would catch the new oil portrait unveiled behind him. Foster Ashworth at maybe 50, painted from an old photograph, healthy and commanding. Nothing like the man slumped in the chair beneath it with a blanket over his knees and a G-tube hidden under his jacket. I stood at his side in a black dress Priya had helped me pick out, holding a water cup and a folded napkin like the caregiver I was there to be, while 400 people in evening wear took photos of a dying man's face next to a painting of the man he used to be. Julian took the podium at 8:15. He spoke for 11 minutes about his father's legacy, the firm's first office, a converted dry cleaners on Kinsey Street in 1985 with $12,000 in startup capital, the way Foster had built it into a firm managing $2.3 billion in client assets by the time of his stroke. He talked about integrity like it was a family heirloom. He said the word legacy 9 times. I counted because counting had become the thing I did to stay calm. And on the 9th time, as he gestured toward his father's chair and said, "Everything my father built, he built on trust," I stepped forward. I didn't plan the exact words. I'd rehearsed a version in my head 100 times and none of it came out the way I'd practiced. What came out was, "Your father's wearing my father's wedding ring." The room didn't go silent all at once. A ballroom of 400 people doesn't work that way. But the noise dropped in waves outward from where I stood, heads turning, and by the time I'd said it a second time, louder, into the microphone stand I'd pulled toward myself from the side table, the whole room had gone quiet enough that I could hear the string quartet's cellist still playing 4 bars before someone signaled her to stop. "My name is Joe Calder," I said. "My father was Miles Calder. He worked for Ashworth Capital as a senior forensic accountant. He died at your company's family's retreat house on Pine Lake in September of 2013, ruled an accidental drowning. His wedding ring was never recovered from his body. It is currently on your father's right hand. Julian's face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. A full 3 seconds of nothing. Blank shock before the recovery kicked in. And the recovery was fast, practiced, the face of a man who'd spent his career managing rooms. I think there's been some confusion, he said into the podium mic, forcing a small laugh that didn't reach anyone. This woman is my father's caregiver. I'm not sure what's happening right now, but let's not look at his right hand, I said. It's a gold band, rectangular face, engraved inside with the initials MC, LC, and the date June 14th, 1997. That's my parents' wedding date. There's a jeweler's resize mark stamped inside, an R2 from Kessler and Vance on Wabash. You can check it right now in front of everyone. A woman near the front. I found out later she was a board member named Corinne Falk on the Ashworth Capital Board for 19 years. Actually stood up from her table and walked toward Foster's chair, and I watched her lift his hand gently, the way you'd handle something precious, and turn it toward the stage lights. I watched her go still. Julian, she said, not into a microphone, just loud enough to carry in that quiet room. There's an engraving on this. That ring has been in our family for years, Julian said too fast. It could have been my mother's father's. We've never had it appraised. I don't see what this has to do with. I pulled the folded certified copy from my clutch and held it up, my hand shaking badly enough that the paper trembled visibly under the stage lights. This is the original 1997 order card from Kessler and Vance Jewelers on Wabash. It shows a custom gold band ordered for a Calder wedding, engraved to client specification, with 2 documented resizes, one in 1999 and one in 2003. The jeweler's granddaughter pulled this from their archive 4 days ago. It is not a family heirloom of unknown origin. It has a paper trail with my father's name on it going back 27 years. A murmur went through the tables nearest the stage, chairs creaking as people leaned toward each other, and I saw a man in a gray suit near the front. I'd learned later he was a Chicago Tribune business reporter who'd been covering the firm's anniversary as a routine piece, already typing something into his phone. It's not a coincidence, Ring, I said. It's the specific ring my mother had made for my father's wedding band, resized twice at the same jeweler, and it disappeared from his body the night he drowned at a lake house your father drove to alone, the same night, and had detailed the next morning before anyone else could see the inside of that car. That's a fabrication, Julian said, and his voice had climbed half an octave. I don't know what you're implying, but my father wasn't involved in day-to-day site visits. He had people for that. Your groundskeeper remembers him going. I turned toward the back of the ballroom, where Ruben stood near the service entrance in the black suit he wore for these events, and I said, Ruben, can you tell them what you told me? Ruben walked forward. I could see it cost him something. 22 years of loyalty pulling against whatever decision he'd made in that equipment shed, and he stood near the stage and said, in a voice that shook slightly but didn't stop, Mr. Foster drove himself up to the Wisconsin property that Thursday in September of 2013, which he never did on his own. Came back late Friday night, had me detail the Suburban first thing Saturday, full interior steam clean, even though it didn't need it. I've thought about that week for 11 years and never said anything because it wasn't my place. It's my place now. The room had gone from murmuring to something closer to a held breath. Julian's hand had come off the podium and was gripping the edge of it instead, knuckles pale. This is a private family matter that does not belong at a public event, he said, and I could hear the shift happening in real time, the pivot from denial into damage control. If there's a legitimate question here, my family will address it through counsel, not through a scene staged by an employee with what sounds like a personal grievance dressed up as. He stopped himself, recalibrated, tried a different angle. If anything happened, and I'm not saying it did, it would have happened because Miles Calder was under internal investigation for financial irregularities at the time. That's a matter of record. Ask anyone who worked there. There's no record of that. Renata Osei's voice came from near the ballroom doors. She'd come as my guest, seated at a back table, and she walked forward now with a leather folder in her hand. I subpoenaed personnel records from Ashworth Capital's HR archive 2 weeks ago under a preliminary discovery motion tied to a wrongful death inquiry I filed with the Walworth County DA's office on September 24th. There is no disciplinary action, no internal investigation flag, nothing in Miles Calder's 14-year personnel file except commendations, including one dated 3 months before his death for identifying a 6-figure billing discrepancy in a client account. She let that sit. What I do have, Ashworth is a handwritten memo recovered from your family's own archived correspondence, referencing a, quote, Calder situation resolved, and a payment of $40,000 wired to a man named Harmon Lutz 2 days before Miles Calder's body was recovered. I watched something in Julian's face crack, not break yet, but crack, a hairline fracture spreading from the center outward. That memo could be about anything, he said, but his voice had gone thin. Harmon Lutz is currently cooperating with the DA's office, Renata said, which I hadn't known until that exact second, and I felt my knees actually go weak with relief, because it meant that somewhere in the 17 days between my call and tonight, whatever guilt Lutz had been carrying for 11 years had finally cracked open too. He gave a recorded statement 2 days ago. I won't share its full contents here, but I'll tell you what he said about the man who hired him, which is that it was not you, Mr. Ashworth, it was your father, and that was the moment it broke all the way. Not Julian confessing. He never confessed. Not that night. Not in that room. He stood at that podium insisting the whole thing was a misunderstanding, even as security quietly quietly moved to close the ballroom doors, and 2 board members pulled out their phones. But the moment the room turned, decisively, audibly, a low, collective sound of 400 people simultaneously understanding they were watching something real. Corinne Falk was still holding Foster's hand, the ring catching the stage light, and she looked at Julian and said, quiet enough that I almost didn't hear it, but clear enough that the microphone did. Get me the board's emergency contact list, tonight. Julian didn't finish his speech. Someone cut the microphone. I stood there with my hand still on that podium stand, shaking, while Priya came up beside me and put a hand flat on my back, and I watched a room full of strangers in evening wear stare at the portrait of a healthy, smiling Foster Ashworth hanging above the slumped, unconscious body of the actual man, wearing my father's ring. It's been 8 months since that night. The board suspended Julian as CEO within 72 hours, citing matters requiring internal review, and he resigned outright 5 weeks later, before the second board meeting could vote to remove him formally. The Walworth County DA reopened the case in November because Foster Ashworth has never regained consciousness, and per his neurologist, likely never will, he can't be tried for anything, which still sits wrong in my chest some days, that the one person who could actually answer for it is beyond answering for anything at all. But Harmon Lutz pled to a lesser charge in exchange for full cooperation, and his statement that he'd been hired to intimidate my father into staying quiet about the billing discrepancy he'd found, that it had gone further than either of them planned, that my father had gone into that lake trying to get away from him, is now part of the official record, which is more than I had a year ago, which is more than my mother ever got. Ashworth Capital settled a civil suit with me in March for an amount I'm not allowed to state exactly, per the agreement, though I'll say it was enough to pay off my mother's remaining medical debt from her last 2 years, with enough left that I put a down payment on a small house in Evanston with actual light in the kitchen. Renata still calls it the strongest case built on the least admissible evidence she's ever seen, which she says like it's a compliment. Priya left Halcyon in January and now works ICU nights at Northwestern Memorial, a job she says lets her sleep better even on 12-hour shifts because nobody there ever asks her to lie about a missed session. Ruben is still with the Ashworths, technically. The estate, under new management by a court-appointed conservator overseeing Foster's affairs, kept him on, and he told me over the phone in May that the house feels different now, quieter, like it's finally allowed to be what it actually is instead of what it was pretending to be. Julian moved to Charlotte, according to Corinne Falk, who I still hear from occasionally, and hasn't worked in finance since. The last I heard, he was managing a golf course his wife's family owns. I got the ring back in April, released as personal property once it was fully documented and photographed for the case file. I had it cleaned by the same jeweler who made it, Kessler and Vance, still open on Wabash, run now by the original jeweler's granddaughter, who found the original 1997 order card in their archive without me even asking and cried a little when she saw it, which made me cry too, right there at the counter. I wear it on a chain now, not my finger, because it never fit me and because some things are meant to be carried close rather than worn. Last week, I was standing at my kitchen counter in the new house, coffee going, morning light coming in flat and yellow across the floor the way it does in early June, and I caught the ring swinging against my collarbone in the reflection of the microwave door, and I just stood there for a second. Not sad, exactly, just quiet. The coffee maker still ticking through its last cycle behind me, thinking that my father spent 11 years underwater in every sense of that phrase, and it took a stranger's dying hand to finally bring him back up to the surface. One thing never got resolved, and I've made peace with the fact that it probably never will. Nobody has ever explained why Foster kept that ring instead of disposing of it. Why a man capable of ordering someone silenced would then keep the evidence on his own hand for 11 years, through a stroke, through a coma, through God knows how many people who bathed and dressed him and never once thought to ask. Renata has a theory about guilt, about men like Foster needing to keep a private reckoning nobody else can see. Ruben thinks it was simpler than that, thinks Foster just liked the ring and never once, in 11 years, believed anyone would ever get close enough to notice. I don't know which of them is right. I'm not sure I need to. Anyway, that's the whole story, more or less exactly how it happened. Thanks for sitting through it with me. It's a heavy one, I know, but it felt like the kind of thing that needed saying all the way through. The full story is linked below and on my channel.